help women, save lives, and peacefully end abortion where you live.
I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired.
You were serious about that?
Be inspired to change hearts and minds by joining over 1 million volunteers taking part in the global movement happening in your neighborhood.
She says, pray that I can get through this abortion. And I said, oh, no. So she went ahead and went into the abortion clinic. And she just came out. She told us, I'm not going to get the abortion. We just had a baby saved. We had a baby saved in Memphis today. Praise the Lord.
This is the 40 Days for Life podcast with your host, Sean Carney.
Hello and welcome to the 40 Days for Life podcast. I'm Sean Carney, the president of 40 Days for Life and your host for this podcast, which is dedicated to helping you end abortion. I am joined, of course, back in Texas, Mr. Steve Carlin, who is still wearing a sweater in case a snowstorm comes.
I am never, as cold as it is in Wisconsin, I am never colder than indoors in Texas.
It is freezing in our studio right now. And so you can't see it. There below this desk is a campfire. I don't know if you can feel it with your feet, but
yeah,
you're
singeing the trousers.
Yeah, that's right.
Wait,
my toenails are non-existent as of this moment. And not new, but back.
And not old.
Not old. Dangerous. An old friend who's older than me.
False information.
That is false. Heather Gardner, welcome to the 40 Days for Life team. I don't need to say that because you're back.
Yes.
So Heather, when did I hire you?
2009.
Okay, 2009, the year that was. You started working at the Coalition for Life, our old location, and then like 6 months later, Abby Johnson walked in and you were in the room. So Heather is part of our team now. She ran the Austin Coalition for Life, the Central Texas Coalition for Life, built this empire. Roe is overturned, and we are having her share her many, many gifts with all of you and with our wonderful local campaign leaders. So she is not new to 40 Days for Life. She is back. She left to build her pro-life empire in Austin. She did so. She conquered. She got the T-shirt, and now she's back.
I should have worn, speaking of T-shirts, my vintage T-shirt that I wore to the symposium a couple years ago that you said should be burned, but it's the original.
It's the old school. I didn't say it should be burned. I said never wear it ever again.
I think you should.
I
Anyways.
probably said it should be burned. It's bad. It's like the stamped logo.
It is. It's white and it's like just the blue across with the 40 days, the baby blue across with the 40 Days for Life. And I'm amazed it's still intact.
It looks like my 8-year-old Declan got a press machine in his basement.
So what year is this from?
09. It's probably from 07.
It's probably from 07.
So the brand new, and the angel guy logo was there and everything.
All that's there. So it's the 40 Days logo, but it's
not the yellow 2004.
No, the 2004 campaign. And we'll put Jill can put a picture of Mary Lisa on there. Mary Lisa in this photo. That's 2004, fall of 2004. That's the first 40 Days campaign, and we had the yellow with the black 40 Days for Life written out.
So the branding has improved, is what I'm hearing.
The branding improved. The guy who came up with 40 Days for Life, our logo, is very famous for some very famous logos. I won't name him because all the nuts will boycott him if I ruin his company. But he designed our logo and totally believed in what we do. But he has done some major logos that you would recognize, and I'll just leave it at that. So
awesome. That's
why the logo is super cool. But that shirt does need to be burned, with all that said. So I have a question for you. When you came back and you're now full-time 40 Days for Life, until 2 weeks ago, I thought you spoke Spanish. Did you lie on your resume? You kept telling... I thought you spoke Spanish this whole time.
I never put that in writing. I always say when I get up in front of a predominantly Spanish-speaking audience, I'm usually reading, but I say, no hablo español muy bien, pero yo hablo Spanglish muy well. And that's the extent. I can speak Spanglish really well.
I think somebody, before I hired you originally, told me, and she speaks Spanish. And that was it for me.
So you're telling me I went through all of this
All of
entire time based on a lie.
Yes.
I could have avoided and dodged all of this.
Or
because someone lied about my
Or
Spanish.
you actually lied on your resume.
Okay.
And you went in.
We'll go back and look at the file.
I want to go back and
It's
look
right
at
next to the T-shirt.
Yeah.
Resume.
But I've told, this isn't like
it's in a cabinet.
I have told a lot of people that you speak Spanish.
Why?
Because you do in my mind. And it's not like, of course she
Did you ever
does.
hear me conversing back and forth with Bobby, like back in the day, like when
I
we
thought
didn't
you were
want you
being
to hear
humble,
something?
and Bobby like totally fluent in Spanish, but he won't speak it, because he knows that he sounds like super cool and looks cool. But yeah, you're like a white girl, right? So that's why it was like, and she learned Spanish. That was awesome. Did you like go down to Latin America? I had all this in my mind.
No, I studied it. I should be,
But I
embarrassingly, I have to admit, I should be much more fluent than I am, especially being around the Spanish speakers that I'm around. But I did study in Mexico for a summer, as well as in school.
That's really bad that you didn't learn it there. But I took it 14 years, from kindergarten in my Catholic school in East Texas to 2 years in A&M, and never learned it. I've been in a bind in Mexico for 40 days, and I've been able to get by. It's like amazing how much you know when you may be killed. But yeah, I didn't learn it. I learned the alphabet in Spanish before the English alphabet.
Oh, really?
Just the way my kindergarten did it.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I have been told, because I would use what little I could on the sidewalks, both in College Station and in Austin, and anywhere, to try to talk. If somebody could only speak Spanish, I'm very limited. And then obviously you don't learn, you learn about the airport vocabulary and the grocery store vocabulary. You don't learn pregnancy vocabulary, except for the false cognate of embarazada. It doesn't mean embarrassed.
I've always just stuck to aborto es muy malo.
Es muy malo.
I was trying
and
to
that's it.
diablo.
But I would say something, and then I would say, lo siento, hablo español muy poquito, por favor, más despacio. So please speak slower. And they'd be, okay, and then they'd still keep talking fast to me. And I finally asked some of our bilingual leadership, I was like, what am I know I'm saying it correctly. I'm not that bad at this. I can speak basic whenever I need to. And they would say, it is because your accent is so good. And they do not hear your word. And I'm like, so I had to say, por favor, más despacio.
Despacio. Queso.
I went down and visited some of our Mexican campaigns back in 2015, and one of the campaign leaders insisted she spoke not a word of English. And I thought, okay, I remember a little bit of the high school Spanish, and I've always heard, no matter how bad it is, locals, when you visit some place with a different language, appreciate that you try. I thought I was doing this great thing by dusting off my memories, and the leader who said she spoke not a word of English, at one point she said, "Is okay. We can speak English."
That's what happens, though.
That's how bad I was.
But they're compassionate. Happy D-Day. This podcast is coming out on June the 6th, so we just celebrated Memorial Day a weekend. I'm wearing a George Washington t-shirt. It says POTUS 1. This is part of, there's two things. Number one, D-Day, Memorial Day weekend, and just my anti-Joe Biden sentiment. So I'm trying to remind myself that
all good things.
There were other presidents that existed before this one. So all good things. D-Day, I love D-Day because it's a nostalgic time for America. We were all going to be speaking German or Japanese. It was go time, and we did it, and it produced so many heroes. It produced so many great men and women, and a sentiment that America can do anything. We have taken advantage of that in some areas that are good and bad. We killed Hitler and then just couldn't stop having wars. But it is one of our best moments, and it's something that when I think about all the pro-life work, we get to do this, and we get to do it because we have free speech.
My grandfather stormed the beaches at Normandy, and it's kind of my bucket list thing is to get there and see what he did. His landing craft, it ran aground short. I mean, those waters were choppy and rough anyway that day, right? It ran aground short, and my grandfather was 5.5 feet tall, so some dude carried him to the shore, and his whole unit got wiped out like 3 times over, but he lived to tell about it. He didn't tell about it, actually. We read about it because he didn't talk about it.
Oh,
but
wow.
You said, I think on a previous podcast, there was a moment where he got older and he would talk about it more, or did he never say
Yeah,
anything?
so my grandmother died in 2007, and then there were like the last 2 or 3 years of my grandfather's life, it seemed like he maybe wanted some of the stories to be told. And he went on one of those honor flights where they take the veterans out to Washington, D.C. to visit the memorials. And that's where we learned all this stuff. There was a reporter that went with, and my grandfather was one of only 2 guys who were in the heavy combat. I mean, all gave some gave all, but he was one of the 2 that were in, had taken bullets and shrapnel and all of those sorts of things. And that's where we learned we knew he had a Purple Heart. We knew he had the Bronze Star. We knew he had all these decorations, but he didn't bring them out and he didn't talk about them, but he talked to that reporter, and that's how we learned about it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And great weekend. We just had to watch Saving Private Ryan. But when Spielberg made Saving Private Ryan, they took the original film, and his whole thing was, this has to be accurate. And they changed some of the stuff of how they film, that now they use everything. It was all handheld cameras when they filmed the opening beach scene. It was just phenomenal from a cinematography standpoint, how they shot it. But he wanted it to feel like you were in the boat with him. And the test of that was they were going to show the movie to vets who were at Normandy. And when you read the articles about it, it's this, like, they're excited about it because they know there's absolutely no way even the great Steven Spielberg can recreate this. Like, you cannot recreate what we went through in a movie. And most of them had meltdowns in the opening scene. And in some of the theaters where they tested it, they turned it off out of respect for the veterans because it was so real. They were physically getting sick, and which is awful for them, but great for us who can kind of read about it in a history book, but you can experience it, or not experience it, but you can see it, how it was in a movie, which is very rare for something that happens in history. So really cool little anecdote. So God bless all of them. God bless all of you veterans active, protecting us around the world. We love you. We're praying for you. And we hope that we honor you by taking advantage of our free speech and defending our country, and particularly the unborn. So for God and country. Okay, as we get into summer with our campfire below this desk, we have a summer reading book list that we are going to cover. We have done previous podcasts on pro-life books. We have ruffled feathers. We have caused controversy. We have caused comments on the YouTube page. We will do that again today. So I've got my list. Some of this, I have a tribute to Jim Ball, our leader in Green Bay, who has insulted Walker Piercy. We will refute him later and give him another Walker Piercy book to read. But it's very important to read, obviously, but also these aren't necessarily just pro-life books, but books that relate to abortion and the culture war at large that have a pro-life theme somewhere in them. But some of them are pro-life books, and we're going to start with those, and that is our books. Obviously, we recommend them. That's why we wrote them. If you go to 40daysforlifegear.com, you can get all the books. We haven't done it in a while. We're giving you a promo code. If you use the promo code podcast, you'll get 20% off the entire store. So including the books. The books are the best sellers on the store. But if you do not have it, I highly encourage you, if you're going to get one book, get What to Say When. Just so you're prepared to go to work this week, because abortion is definitely coming up a lot. It's going to come up a lot more as we get into the Dobbs anniversary, the anniversary of the overturning of Roe in a couple of weeks on June 24th. So get What to Say When. We have Fierce Mercy in the store, Abby Johnson's new book. We have This Is When We Begin to Fight. It's a great book written by Steve Carlin, a very patriotic book, actually. And great Father's Day book. This Is When We Begin to Fight. We also have the original. We have the original 40 Days for Life book. We have The Beginning of the End of Abortion, which I wrote in 2018. And we have To the Heart of the Matter. So And obviously, our newest edition is The Scalpel and the Soul. That is not 20% off. You have to pay full price for that, but it'll be a signed hardback pre-order that the official release date of that is June 20th. So go get books that you don't have, give them away, but make those your summer priority list. The 40 Days for Life books, we'll put ours first, just out of shameless promotion. Okay, I'm going to start with controversy.
Yes.
Do it.
Gloves are off.
The gloves are off. I love Walker Piercy. This is well known and it troubles some people. Great Catholic author. He converted to Catholicism. He went to Columbia to be a doctor, contracted tuberculosis, could never serve a patient. So he moved back home to the South and became a writer, which is basically like saying, I'm going to live in my mom's basement my whole life. So raised by his uncle, lost both of his parents very young. The Moviegoer is his first book. It wins National Book of the Year. So he's like the opposite of every writer. His first book was like the best book of that year. Okay, my recommendation is Walker Piercy's Lancelot. Lancelot. This is a brilliant book for our culture. It is short, and I'll just give you the premise because once you start reading it, you can't stop. And most of his books aren't like that. There is a guy, of course, in a mental institution. You don't know why he's there. He's not sure he's in the mental institution or he's in a hospital, the patient. And a priest walks in, and the guy who's in the mental institution talks the whole time in the presence of the priest. He's known the priest his whole life. It's his best friend. So they have flashbacks. He's angry at God. He's angry at the culture. He's still wondering why he's in a mental institution or a hospital. The priest doesn't say a word because the guy just keeps talking the whole time, and the priest speaks the last 2 pages. It's awesome.
Cool.
Sounds
and
great.
It's not that long, you said.
It's not that long, and it is very pro-life, and it is we talk a lot about living a culture of life, or we have the book To the Heart of the Matter, but just loving your family, loving your kids, and continue to struggle and actually never giving up on the culture. And I think the theme of Lancelot is it actually really isn't that bad. And when you're reading it, you're like, no, it's really bad. This is bad. But the guy, because he's out of his mind, he's honest.
Sure. He's not, to quote the other great Walker Piercy book, he's not lost in the cosmos.
He's not lost in the
cosmos.
cosmos.
He knows who he is.
And the priest is on the receiving end, and the silence of the priest is so wise and a good example for us. And he doesn't speak until he actually has an opportunity, and it's at the very end of the book.
What do you got, Heather?
Okay, so my first one, I actually love Christopher West. I've taken several of the Theology of the Body courses that he offers at the Institute near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He is world-renowned for helping to educate people about John Paul II's Theology of the Body. He has a lot of great books out there. There's one of them that he came out with a few years ago called Fill These Hearts. It's a great, easy read, super easy, especially if you just really like reading about kind of current events, and talks about applying the meaning of life to what is going on with our culture today. Just kind of goes over different things about the media, about what we're seeing with the different movements that are happening, the different social movements that are happening, certainly the redefinition of marriage and all those sorts of things goes into that. And it's really a hopeful, uplifting book. Again, not too heady, which a lot of Theology of the Body books can be. And it's awesome. I love it.
His aren't. He's great. But Christopher West has like changed people's life.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have teenage sons, they definitely need to read his Theology of the Body. They need to read all of his stuff. But I mean, he is absolutely phenomenal at articulating why we just can't have sex with everyone we want to people who are doing that or want to do it. And that's hard to do.
It's nice to have the practical advice that isn't sort of like, sometimes I think you get into Theology of the Body and it's like, justice and we need to love the other person. And like, how does that play out in your day-to-day life? And he seems to really be able to kind of get to some of those actual answers about what does that mean if you're 19 or you're engaged or you've been married for 10 years.
Yeah. And one of the things I've always loved about him from the very beginning, when I first saw him actually here in College Station, is he has songs going through his head a lot. And of course, he has a certain era that's his favorite, but I always have songs going through my head. So he loves to make a lot of cultural references. He's super big into U2 and a few others, especially of that era. But I like that.
U2, who sold us out in Ireland.
The pro-abortion U2.
Back
Thanks,
to the
Bono.
pro-life topic.
I try not to
You
be that
loser.
guy. I try not to be that guy, but I quit listening to them entirely. After
Yeah.
that. It's like,
No,
you can give me like the Foo Fighters. Like I know Dave Grohl's a complete pagan, but he's honest about who he is. Like, come on.
No, you two, like the way they did it was terrible. I tell you somebody who's never going to sell out somebody. George Strait, the king of country.
Amen.
Married 50 years. Just celebrated 50 years of marriage 2 months ago. Way to go, George.
King of country.
Absolutely. This is where the cowboy rides away. You got a book?
Yeah, so I've got the book that I have is Live Not by Lies by Rob Dreher. And he really made a lot of headlines a few years ago with a book called The Benedict Option. And there was a lot of controversy about it. Is it telling us to pull out of the world? Is it not saying that? Like there were books written about like what did this book actually mean? And so I was like, I don't know if I want to get in that controversy. So finally I read it and was like, this actually seems pretty non-controversial to me. I think it's all the way that we're all trying to live life in this crazy world that we live in right now. So I thought it was fine, but I didn't think it was worth all of the discussion. But then shortly thereafter, he releases this book called Live Not by Lies, which got much less attention and I thought was much better. And he interviews a lot of the dissidents and the Christians who kept their faith living under the Iron Curtain during the Cold War.
Awesome.
So you've got the Stasi, you've got the KGB, you've got all of the chaos behind the Iron Curtain and the persecution of religious people and lies everywhere. And he talks to these people, how did you keep your faith through this? And what lessons can we apply in this time? We don't have a KGB, but we've got diversity, equity, and inclusion people who are making life tough for a lot of people. And we've got schools that are running amok, and we've got all these sorts of things. And so I thought that was extremely helpful, extremely encouraging. I think it can be very easy sometimes if you are like-minded with those of us who are doing the podcast today or those who are listening and watching the podcast. It can be very easy to kind of think, oh, the world's going to heck in a handbasket. We're going to be locked up before too long. What are we going to do here? And this is just real practical advice about how you not just maintain your resolve, but also keep your composure and your Christian joy along the way. No matter how hard it gets, no matter what persecution comes, they're dealing with a much realer and immediate persecution than we have right now. But I just thought it was super encouraging to see these folks who, many of them were born in communism. They didn't know freedom. They didn't know Christendom. They didn't know a lot of things that we take for granted, and yet they managed to hang close to God the entire time. So I thought that was a tremendous book.
There's 35 cities in Croatia. They were definitely under the Iron Curtain, and there's 35 40 Days for Life campaigns in Croatia. I mean, Ante, our leader there, we've had a lot of Croatians who are very influential say he literally could run for president and he would win. I mean, that country is 98% Catholic and 98% faithful Catholic, and that's what happens when you live under the Soviets for so long. So
yeah, persecution, I don't know if I'd say it's a good thing, but it can be a very good thing for our relationship with God. And for these people that are interviewed and live not by lies, it certainly was.
Christians in general have not done well when times are good.
Yeah.
We don't do power well.
No.
We don't do wealth well. So it's really, we live in this secular, essentially pagan culture that's just so hostile towards anything that looks like faithful Christianity. It's almost like the DOJ doesn't like us, but that's absurd. Yeah. But, we live in these weird times, and I'm kind of glad for it. We have 8 kids, so people are like, how could you bring a child into the world? And I'm like, I think it's harder in the 80s or the 70s where there's a lot of gray and you're sort of getting out of the greatest generation, the World War II generation, where it's just like black and white, and maybe you tell your kids that you love them, maybe you don't, but just you read the paper and you work at GE for 35 years and then you retire. And you were like transitioning into the baby boomers and the rebels and Vietnam and all that craziness. And that led into a lot of like weird morality, relativism, essentially, in the 80s and even the 90s. I think now it's easier with my kids to just point and say, that guy thinks he's a girl. And they're like, but he's not. You know, some of it is just...
That's sort of like the example of why the book is titled Live Not by Lies. And he quotes Solzhenitsyn, who I love. I don't really like reading his works, but his speeches are like, I read the Day in the Life of Ivan, and it was just painful. Like, brilliant. I can appreciate it, but it was not an enjoyable read.
Who's that guy whose name I can't pronounce?
Yeah. But he gave some of these great speeches, and one of them he said, you know, we don't have to go out into the public square and shout the truth and make a lot of noise. Like, maybe we're too afraid, maybe we're not ready, but at the very least, if we want to live with dignity and we want our children to be able to look us in the eye and respect us, we can avoid telling lies like a man is a woman, or a woman is a man, or abortion is healthcare.
Live Not by Lies. Great title and great concept. So be sure to check that out. Of course, we're putting these on the screen, and you can buy them wherever they're sold. Okay, I have a combo of two, and I've mentioned these on the podcast before, but they're just, I had people write back and say they were awesome, because when we talked about them, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago. Benjamin Weicker, cool name. He wrote 10 books that every conservative must read and 10 books that screwed up the world. And I would put him as an academic. I think those are academic books that are very
accessible, though.
Very accessible and so well done. You're not going to go out and read Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler unless you're in like a college class. But you really want to know, all we know is Hitler's really evil and everybody else, the rest of us are really good. You know, the hell is a 1-bedroom apartment. It's just Hitler sitting in there. And so, but we don't know what he said and what he believed and how in the world he could possibly take over, because most people saw him kind of as a nut, and then he ended up taking over all of Germany. And Mein Kampf, My Struggle, you know, he breaks that down. That's part of the 10 books that screwed up the world. That's not the good one.
Oh, okay.
I just want to clarify for the viewers, that's part of the ones that screwed up the world. But that I'm using that as an example of, you hear people like Peter Singer, who we've talked about a lot on the podcast. I would never tell anybody to go read his books. He's a nut, and a perverted one at that. But you need to know what's in them, you know, and I rarely do that. Like, I hate people that like quote the Federalist Papers, but they've never read them. But on some of these, that's the best way, especially in our culture. And 10 books that screwed up the world. He has a bonus chapter called "And 5 Others That Didn't Help." Very well done. Very well done. And then the 10 books that every conservative must read, which I don't like the title of that, but it could be 10 books that save the world, are great. I think Lord of the Rings is in there. The Jerusalem Bible. They're very diverse. It's not like we will pick on the bad guys and we will pick on the good guys. There's a lot of authors in those that people have heard of that aren't the ones that necessarily get a lot of credit.
So here's one of the things I think needs to be said about 10 books that screwed up the world is, when I first saw that and had not yet read it, I thought, like, it's got Mein Kampf in it. Like, great, we all know World War II is bad. Like, I don't need to be sold on that. I don't need to be convinced on that. But what surprised me is when he gets into what is actually in Mein Kampf. For everybody who hates Hitler and they you know, these are fascists, these are Nazis, America's becoming Nazi, all of those sorts of things, like, there is a lot of Mein Kampf that is in the worldview of the average American or the average Westerner today.
No, because Mein Kampf, that's why it's so good that Weicker wrote the book, because you can go through it because you're like, Hitler's evil, let's kill him. But if you just say this is a book that was written, and at the end you give the name and then you give the title, or you give the author, oh, no doubt people are reading this today and they're like, it's a good point.
New York Times Book of the Year.
Yeah, really good point. Who wrote this? Adolf Hitler. Oh, you know. So Hitler ruins everything, as the phrase in Germany is now. Hitler ruined everything. But that sentiment, when you go into these books, because everybody says, how in the world could you do a late-term abortion? How in the world could you just openly, if you're Iceland, say, we have cured Down syndrome? Finally, none of them walking around anymore. We'll pat ourselves on the back. Like, how do you get to that point? 10 books that screwed up the world show you get to it with tenderness, with love, with compassion, with all these nice phrases that no one wants to define. And then you can do what you want because you can be God. And I think one guy who he either gets all the attention or he gets off the hook is Darwin. And people, because the theory of evolution gets sort of all the attention, and you have, we were created, all that stuff, it can almost become a distraction in the person of Darwin. And he's a nut.
Yes.
And I think that's what's good about that book, is they don't focus necessarily on and he created evolution, therefore he's a nut. It's like he was a nut, and like the theory of evolution was just like a sidebar for him.
It was a vehicle for him implementing some of the worst ideas about the dignity of the human person.
It was, but it's probably, sadly, probably his warmest document. I mean, so it's like Darwin on Christmas Eve, compared to the other stuff that he wrote. So, great recommendations. Benjamin Wiker, Wiker. 10 books every conservative must read, 10 books that screwed up the world, and both very entertaining, I would say. Easy reads, short, even though they sound like they're really long.
We're getting into Inception territory here. We're recommending books that recommend books.
I know, and I hate doing that, but those are so good, and those books,
they are.
They're like well known, but not well known enough, for my opinion, for as good as they are, because there are particularly 10 books that screwed up the world, because you just need to go read Lord of the Rings, right? And then all the other ones he has in there. But Margaret Sanger and Peter Singer, I don't want them buying those books, on Amazon. So that's definitely
the Kinsey one, Alfred Kinsey, or was that Architects of the Culture of Death?
He's in both. He's a double dip.
I've got like this sort of like integrity thing where if I start a book, I almost never don't finish it, and I'm gonna I'm not gonna skip around.
Going down with the ship.
That was so brutal. I had to skip the Kinsey chapter. I got like a third of the way, and I was like, I think I know as much as I need to know right now.
Yeah.
Darwin's in Architects of the Culture of Death too. And Darwin was somebody who I was like just shocked how much of a crazy he was. And now he's, I don't know, quit talking about him. Your turn. Sorry, you got to follow.
I got two. It's fine. It's fine. I got two of them. I would say, so one of them I have on my list is actually a book that's called Scrooge and Cratchit Detectives. It's a really neat book. I'm finishing it, so I won't give much away, but it's more of a mystery. It does have some pro-life themes in it, but it, of course, takes Dickens' Christmas Carol, those characters, and kind of creates some fictional storylines from there.
Great.
It's interesting. I like it. So if you want a little bit of a break, maybe from a specifically pro-life book, or specifically, there you go.
It's better than Mein Kampf at the very least.
It's definitely a little more cheery.
Yeah, it's
than
cheery.
Mein Kampf.
Yeah. And then another one that actually is more directly related to addressing the culture again is, this one was so great. It definitely brought tears to my eyes with some of the parts of it. Sue Ellen Browder is the author. She wrote a book called Subverted: How I helped the sexual revolution hijack the women's movement. So Sue Ellen Browder, she actually was an editor for Cosmo magazine in the, I believe, 70s and 80s. She was very, very familiar with the names that we hear of today that are associated with the National Organization for Women, the National Abortion Rights Action League, which was formerly known as National Abortion Repeal, National Association for Repeal of Abortion Laws. So now it's National Abortion Rights Action League. She was familiar with all of those people that got started in that. She goes into the behind the scenes details of how abortion was not always a force, a push for the women's movement. And we hear that if you're familiar at all with groups like Feminists for Life, or if you're familiar with groups like even Susan B. Anthony List, because of course their name, the original feminists were pro-life. And so it's like, if you hear that, or you see that on a sign at the March for Life, it's like, what happened? What happened to like the suffragists and the marching for like women's right to vote and all these different things, to now it's seen as you're crazy and you're not a real woman, or you're not really fighting for women's rights if that does not include abortion at the top of the list. So how do we get to that point? She really demonstrates that well in this book. And of course she had a conversion herself. It's awesome. It will not disappoint.
Does it spoil the book if you tell us kind of how that conversion came about, or is that
No, that'll spoil it.
It'll spoil it. It'll spoil it. But yeah, so like I said, Cosmo magazine editor. None of the stuff that you read in Cosmo today, if you bother paying attention to that, is at all surprising.
I haven't read Cosmo.
No, you
Steve's
don't
a big
pick that
Cosmo guy.
Yeah.
Cosmo Kramer?
Cosmo Kramer. Oh gosh.
I'm Cosmo.
There you go. So those are two more that I have right now.
Cool. Well, Sean, this is going to be an opportunity for you to laugh at me, because I've kind of like quit raving about him constantly anymore. But I love the writer Anthony Esselin.
And for our viewers, he's here. He just comes out, Steve melts and passes out. So we had him on the podcast.
We did.
Anthony Esselin. You converted me on him.
Oh, good.
I never really heard of him, and of course I'm a big Peter Kreeft guy, and Anthony Esselin's like the new Peter Kreeft, because Kreeft is 80 years old, and yet still surfing and writing. But anyways, we had him on. I read some of his books. Phenomenal. Awesome. And then he was great on the podcast.
Yeah, he was. And I love all of his books. And here's why I'm recommending this.
Hold on.
Called...
You were like Chris Farley in those Saturday Night Live. We'll show a clip of Chris Farley like interviewing celebrities, and this is Steve actually interviewing Anthony Esselin, his hero.
I didn't have to say who you were, because, man, I mean, everyone knows who you are. You're
Anthony Esselin. Remember when you came on the 40 Days for Life podcast? That was awesome.
That was awesome. I think Chris Farley asked Paul McCartney, remember when you were with the Beatles?
You remember when... Remember when you were with the Beatles?
Yeah, that was awesome. That was Steve. Okay, keep going.
It's a true fact. I love all his books. My favorite one, it's got like kind of, I think, one of the more boring titles of them. He's got one that's called 10 Ways to Destroy the Imagination of Your Child, right? Like if you're seeing that at the bookstore, you're kind of like picking that up and at least reading the back. This one is called Reflections on the Christian Life, which I'm probably not going to pick up, except for I was already a fan. And here's what I like about it. He's talking about what it means to live our life in Christ. And there are many books that do a very good job of sort of skewering everything that's wrong with the culture. They can point out this is wrong. They can make fun of it. It's funny. It's witty. And they can tear down all that needs to be torn down. But this thing is kind of like, what do you build up in its place? And you've got the skewering of that which deserves it, but you also have the joy that comes out of things like vocation, the joy that comes out of following Christ, the joy that comes out of like the everyday ordinary of life. And I think that is so critical right now, because it's so easy to get overwhelmed. I mean, we were talking about Mein Kampf, we're talking about the Soviets during just a few minutes ago during this podcast. That can be very negative, but we need to have the replacement. What fills the vacuum if you get rid of the negative? And I think he does a wonderful job. It uplifts the spirit, but not in a sappy or a saccharine sense.
In a moment, we're going to get to our other wonderful author, Michael O'Brien.
Who you will also laugh at me for.
No, yes. That's Matt.
Okay.
I love Michael O'Brien. I love Michael O'Brien. Matt doesn't. He doesn't like angry Irish Canadians. But Michael O'Brien has a great quote about basically what you just said. Yeah, but we're talking about like the Nazis, and we're talking about communism, and they would catch the defectors and burn them in ovens. The ones that were trying to help the Americans. They were just ruthless people, and we're these great tolerant people. And Michael O'Brien says that's the difference between the East and the West. The East is the crocodile. Cut your head off. You don't even know he's there. You're dead. It's the violence of the East that we saw in communism. The West is the anaconda. It holds you, it comforts you, it squeezes you, and the whole time you don't realize it's killing you. It's suffocating you to death so it can consume you. And that's the Western culture. But we're so tolerant and we're so nice, and you don't want people to be happy. You don't want people to be free. What do you care? Why do you want to control somebody else? It's what Pope Benedict called the dictatorship of relativism, which is we are going to be so tolerant we will control you.
I was just in Canada for the National March for Life, and Canada is brutal. I don't know if people realize how brutal Canada is.
It's awful. And God bless all the Canadians we have up there who are just rock solid and tough, because forget the fact that it's cold and all they care about is hockey and like beer. But aside from that, there's such a lack of Christian history. We have the North American martyrs, but you can go into France and Germany even and Italy, and so much of the faith is dead. Ireland for sure. But they can go back to their identity. I mean, pagan Ireland's kind of a joke, right? There's a Catholic church, 3 on every block. So they're mad and they're like storming out the room like the teenager, like, I hate my parents and we don't want to be Catholic anymore. We don't want anything to do with Christianity. And they're slamming the door. But they're going to come back because Ireland without Catholicism is useless and no one cares about it whatsoever, including the Irish deep down. So I think you have that in France and Italy. Canada just always seems like a country that has no identity. So we're like, what's pagan and fun? And they latch onto it. They don't have an abortion law in Canada. People think we make that up.
No,
there's no abortion. You can just do whatever you want with abortion.
More restrictive in China. The People's Republic of China at least has a ban on sex selection abortions, the gender side. And this is where, as you mentioned, the sort of the anaconda analogy, like we were just at the Canadian March for Life. They're nice, and that's their thing. They're nice, and we see this in some U.S. places too, like Minnesota. Nice, Minnesota. They're nice. They're chopping up babies, but at least they like smile at you when they do.
Denying health care to a baby who survives abortion.
Yeah, all these things. And the niceness is really a false front, and we've got to make a clear distinction of niceness is not the same thing as kindness, and there's no kindness in some of these places that have completely turned their back on God.
Okay, my next one, this is definitely controversial, but y'all have named very wholesome, uplifting reads.
Oh, come on now, let's go.
So, Jim Ball, who didn't like Moviegoer by Walker Piercy, definitely get Lancelot, Jim Ball in Green Bay, faithful podcast listener. I got another one. Granted, Steinbeck was a communist, but who's perfect? Winter of Our Discontent.
Ooh.
You read that, right?
Yes. My favorite quote is not fit for the podcast.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great book. It's short. It's about a little fishing town in New York. It's a morality tale because the main character is virtuous. He's good. He wants to do the right thing. He thinks about things. He has a good conscience. He works a job. He's a disappointment in life. He was supposed to become something. Instead, he runs a grocery store. And you follow him in the mundane thing of life, and temptation comes in many forms of business, other things. But it's him going through those temptations and you kind of rooting for him, knowing he's like a good guy. And then we won't tell you how it ends. But ending no one sees coming for sure. Great book. Winter of Our Discontent, adult only. And if you enjoy some of the darker side of the podcast, you want a famous, like, dark book that doesn't really feel dark, but it is, Winter of Our Discontent.
That also explains like 7 months of my life each year. You could call like October until May the Winter of Steve's Discontent.
Winter of Steve's Discontent. That's the sequel. And the guy is actually like, he's just going through life angry. It's just a much easier storyline.
It's supposed to be the summer of George.
Yeah, instead it was the winter of Steve's discontent. Okay, so that was mine.
Yeah, that's a great book. And here's the thing I'll say. I understand when you got negative feedback on Walker Percy, like he's just not going to be for everybody. Sometimes
No.
it can be a little bit painstaking.
He's
I
not
think, to
for
read through.
Jim Ball in Green Bay. Jim Ball's like a meat and potatoes straight shooter, who's a great guy. Walker Percy relates to the person who's like, why in the world does this go on?
Yeah, sometimes if I read Walker Percy, I'm like, I could read, and I find myself doing something else because I just don't feel like picking it up. I might think it's great, worthy, all of those sorts of things, but I'm just not in the mood to read it. I think that Winter of Our Discontent is a little less heavy in that sense. It may have some dark tones to it, but I think it's just a little bit easier to read, and I found myself a little more motivated to pick it up at night.
The problem with Walker Percy is that he's a genius academically and intellectually. And so that comes out in his writing. And he always has an expert. It's a lawyer, it's a psychiatrist, it's a doctor. They're always the main characters, and they're always dilapidated. What's brilliant is they're the ones that have left their faith and are alcoholics or have ruined their life or ruined their kids. And they're the only ones that make sense in a sane world. And he sets it up every time, and you're totally into it. You're like, this guy is awful. And he ends up being the sane one in the world that's lost its mind. But you got to get through a lot. Steinbeck doesn't do that with Winter of Our Discontent. It's very, you're instantly in.
Yeah.
It's easy to read. So
Sometimes it takes me 50 pages to decide if I can, I said I don't really put books away after I pick them up, but there's 50 pages of like, I think I'm going to take this back to the library. And I didn't feel that way about Winter of Our Discontent.
But with Walker Percy, like during the book, you want like oysters and beer because he's like all these Louisiana references. Winter of Our Discontent, you're like, I really want to go to a New England fishing town and just walk around and have a cup of coffee. So, great book.
Couple more. I'm gonna do two more again.
Go for it.
Okay. So I'm currently reading The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. I hear that is the next most popular book in the world after the Bible.
It is, and it's on a list. We're allowing you to do Imitation of Christ because it's deemed too good for the 40 Days for Life podcast. It's like saying the Book of Genesis or something. So, but it's a must, and anytime we talk about it, we do it a lot during Lent. The Imitation of Christ. It's amazing how many people we introduce it to. Thomas A. Kempis, Tommy A. How he'd be known in East Texas.
Sure,
T-Bone.
T-Bone. TK. TK if he were growing up in my hometown. But
Always dignity.
always
on the 40
dignity.
Days for Life
Yeah.
podcast.
If Thomas Kempis came back, he'd have a lot of cool nicknames. But great book and a handbook for the saints.
Yeah.
It's just so easily applicable. I mean, I was reading it. I'm going through it right now too, Heather, and I didn't know. I was like, when was this written? It's written a long time ago, but it's in a style.
It's the 12th century.
Yeah. It's in a style and it's in a fashion where I would have guessed if I was just picking up, I don't know, like 1700s, not the Middle Ages. And it's wherever you're at in your faith journey, it's got something to say to you. I do it as kind of my morning prayer routine. I just read like a page or two until I feel the Lord speaking something on my heart, and then I contemplate it. And it's a great... You can breeze through it if you want. It's not hard, but I think it's a little bit richer if you savor each paragraph of it.
Yeah, it's easy to pick up, easy to put down, not because it's bad, but because it just ends. It has these little sections. It's also written for desolation, consolation. It's the full spiritual life of Christianity, that we tear ourselves down. Who are you? You're nothing. From dust you came, dust you shall return. How could you honestly claim to be anything more than a sinner? And so you get to the nature of man, and then of course the building up of what we're capable of through the grace of God. It's very positive. I love it, but he's good at kicking your butt, and I think that's really needed.
Yeah, we need that.
Yeah, and so great monk. Thank you, Thomas A. Kempis, for that huge gift.
Absolutely.
Attaboy, T-Bone.
Attaboy, T-Bone.
Okay, my next one is actually pretty pretty personal. So it's called Won by Love by Norma McCorvey. If you don't know by now, after you're listening to this podcast or being involved in the pro-life movement, Norma McCorvey is the Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade. This book has an important role in, I guess, just my story, my life, because shortly after I was hired, apparently based on a lie,
It's true.
at the Coalition
we'll
for
document
Life,
that later.
the Brazos Valley Coalition for Life. I was actually seeing a spiritual director who is this beautiful Italian nun, Sister Raffaella, and it was a very difficult transition for me from going from volunteer student for several years to full-time thinking, breathing, living this nonstop, and a lot of spiritual warfare with that. And so because of that, Sister Raffaella actually recommended you should read this book. It's called Won by Love. It really speaks to the heart of what you're doing. And I think she knew that I needed some sort of boost, encouragement. So I read this book. In case you didn't know, Norma McCorvey had a conversion. The Jane Roe versus Wade, which the abortion movement hates when you point that out. But in this here, you read about this really hard, just very difficult woman who was the Jane Roe, and then she worked in the abortion industry. She lived an alternate lifestyle for many, many years. She was really, really harsh to the pro-lifers that were outside. We don't know anything about that. And eventually it was just the combination of a lot of things. And ultimately it was Christ working on her heart and made her convert. And so I finished reading this book, and a month later, Abby Johnson walked into our office.
Hey!
And that's kind of the funny part of it is, so if you've read the book Unplanned, you'll know that I was more of the doubting Thomas. This isn't in the movie or anything. So if you're like, I don't remember that in the movie, it's not in the movie.
You were.
I was the doubting Thomas.
I didn't want to bring this up, but you were the one. Bobby's just all in.
Yeah.
Praise God. I know we're going to get sued and want to protect Abby. And then, because when Abby leaves, she was there.
Yeah.
When she came back here, this building, we all had like a powwow.
Yes.
And we're going to get sued, but we got to protect her. This is awesome.
Nobody says anything.
Bobby's Cloud 9, like praise God, Saint Therese mode. And you're like, I don't know about it.
Yeah, no.
I don't know if I believe her.
No.
And that was great because you and Abby ended up becoming the closest friends afterwards. And so, but you were the one that was like, it took a couple days.
It took longer than that, I think. I got all the phone calls of the media wanting to talk with her, and then just a lot of the salon.com and all those types of.
I'm more skeptical than you too as a human.
Yeah.
So you're a much more trusting person than I am. And I never doubted her. I get asked that all the time. But like when I walked in and I saw her, I believed her.
All the things that we had experienced on the sidewalk for many, many years, that's what was going through my mind. Plus.
Personal for you. You were mean to me last week.
Right. I had phone conversations with her because I was the one who answered the phone first. That was the order. So like I had complaints. I had Abby in my ear, complaints. I had Abby on the sidewalk, and I just was like,
Abby likes when we mention that she was mean.
Yeah.
Because she always brings up, I wasn't always nice, because she's like, when Unplanned came out, she's like,
oh, I was
I
too
really
nice.
wasn't like nice to them that much.
Yeah. No, it's true. I just, those are the thoughts that were coming to my mind. And I just
So
was
you
sitting
read
there.
Norma McCorvey's book, who had a full conversion, and
Right,
then your
and I'm
Planned
like,
Parenthood
wow.
director has a full conversion, and you're like, she's full of crap.
Right. That's the irony of this all, is I read this beautiful testimony so shortly before this, and I still was in doubt. So yeah, that's kind of I guess, looking back on it, it's kind of funny now, but I really was all the things that were going through my mind was, man, like Planned Parenthood's really going the extra mile right now to pull the wool over our eyes. Like, and I'm just trying to find the holes in her story. Like I'm sitting there and then
The
Karen,
other workers are emailing me, like, I want to leave too.
Yeah.
Like all this stuff's happening. I'm like, this would be a pretty big coup.
And like it would, but I kept thinking I don't put it past them. And then like in the meantime, Karen, who also worked in the office with us, she's like crying and she's like, I love you and let's be best friends. And she writes her phone number on a piece of paper and slides it across the couch. And I was like, doing, Karen? Are you crazy? Like,
but Karen would have read Mein Kampf and given Hitler like the cell phone. Like, you need prayers. Here's my cell phone. You're like, I think he's a murderous dictator. You may not want to give your cell phone. So Karen's just sweetheart.
Yeah.
But then what people don't know, and we're going to show you the footage right now. You started working in the abortion industry.
oh yeah, yeah.
This is
It's an
awful.
Unknown fact.
You did it.
Yeah.
You were in Unplanned as an abortion worker.
Yeah.
Show the clip.
Had to be carefully reassembled in a petri dish to make sure that none of its parts were missing. Because if they were, it meant that they were still inside.
So Chuck and Carrie, who made Unplanned, fly me out for that Thanksgiving week.
Yeah.
Okay, the movie came out in March. So I went out the November before, and they wanted me to see it for accuracy. So I sitting in this little cool mini theater, actually, and I watch it. And I'm like, I get to that part. I'm like, Heather is in the movie as an abortion worker? It just didn't fit whatsoever in my world. You did a good job.
all 2 seconds of it.
I saw you there, and there was kind of like
Is
no,
that
it couldn't be.
Is that our Austin leader?
Should
That
we
was
know
funny
her?
though, because you're trying to make like mean abortion worker face,
Yeah.
and it doesn't work because you're a very cheerful person.
Okay, here's the funny thing you should know, everyone should know about me. I don't know if I can say this on the podcast.
You can say anything on the
Use an
podcast.
acronym.
That's right.
I've heard you say this
If
before.
we haven't been
I
banned
have-
from YouTube, we're not going to
I have RBF, so it wasn't me trying to make a mean face. That's my face. All I had to do was just not act and then take a cup through a pass-through wall and turn around and like put a tray down. That was the extent. I had no lines, so can't really say I was acting.
So you the notorious RBF then? Is that
Yeah.
you got the
Yeah.
notorious RBG?
Oh, I have many stories that start with my
She
RBF.
was the Planned Parenthood worker that lied on her resume about speaking Spanish, and that's how she
Yeah.
got hired.
Mm.
That was it. So, okay, what was the name of this book?
It's called One by Love by Norma
Yes,
McCorvey.
One by Love. And in that genre, Hand of God, first book I
Yes,
gave Abby by
yes.
Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who's the first abortion doctor to ever convert. Hand of God was kind of risky of me, but I gave it to Abby like literally the day after the
She
day she quit.
references it.
She references it all the time, and
Yeah.
it was great, and it's a great book. But even I gave it to her, and that night I'm talking to Mary Lisa, and I'm like, was that a little much? You know, is that kind of just extreme? Like right off the bat, you're reading the former abortion doctor, but like, is she gonna throw it in the trash and just think, okay,
Should have started her with 10 books that destroyed the world.
10 books that screwed up the world?
yeah.
Yeah. Or
Why contraception is bad.
Winter of Our Discontent.
Yeah.
I should just give her Moviegoer by Walker Pearson.
right.
Read this; it'll make sense of it. I don't know what's going on right now. Okay, wrapping this up. Steve, we got to get to 2 books. The first, The Lighthouse, Michael O'Brien.
Yeah, this is. I think I'm putting this on here in large part because a lot of Michael O'Brien books are 600, 700, 800 pages. I read it one time on like a transatlantic flight. We
me
were
too.
stranded. We had a flight delay. Everybody with my party is miserable. I'm just like, I'm having the time of my life. This is like, I don't know, 200, 250 pages. It's very.
It's like one chapter of one of his other
yeah,
books.
yeah. I can't even say on the podcast what Matt calls one of my favorite Michael O'Brien books. But this book, I've been thinking about as we prepared for this podcast, and even as we're sitting here recording, I've been trying to figure out how do I describe this book. But the best way that I can think is that any Michael O'Brien book, I think, takes you into the heart of human suffering. And that sounds like a really bad thing. But the way he does it, it's not. It kind of like breaks your heart. And one of his books, Peter Kreeft has a review, and he says, it will break your heart, and it will show you why your heart needed to be broken. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And so this book, I recommend anything I've read by Michael O'Brien. But if you're looking for something that's not going to be an 800-page commitment, this is a good one to start with.
The only thing with him is Father Elijah did not age well. It's so dated. It's awesome.
Because it all came true.
It became true and worse. So, so it's like, all right, man up and put your collar on, right? I mean, big deal. It's like the church is persecuted. It's like, big deal. But I think I'll add on to that, A Father's Tale. I mean, if you have kids who you have a bad relationship with, or you've had a tragedy, you've lost a child even, I think that A Father's Tale is so beautiful, of just a father's love for his son. Now, like you, I read that on my way there and back from Europe, because it's like literally like 958 pages, some absurd number. So it goes on my list of like, Michael, you need a better editor, or somebody needs to say, hey, we got to.
You ever heard of a thing called a sequel?
The editor needs to be fired. Like, it's like, this didn't have to be, this long, but it's very good, and it keeps you the whole time. And it's such a beautiful story about a man pursuing his son, and it's just so wholesome in that, with his struggle with his own faith and all that. It's a great book. And Theophilus is very good. You want to go back to early church. Theophilus is very good. Great book. So we love us some Michael O'Brien. Matt's not here. Matt doesn't like Michael O'Brien. Some people don't like certain things.
He one time gave me a book and he said, if you like this Michael O'Brien book, here's a guy who wrote a similar book, but he did it well. And that book was actually awesome. So,
and if Michael O'Brien listened to the podcast, we want him to know we love you, Michael O'Brien. And we know it's hard living in Canada. Steve just got back from there, and you are a great writer. So keep writing. Don't listen to Matt Britton. The last one on your list.
Brideshead Revisited. Yeah. You were talking before about reading Walker Percy, and it just makes you want oysters and all the Cajun stuff. If you read Brideshead Revisited, he wrote it. He was like, Evelyn Waugh was recovering. I think he was injured in the army, and he's recovering, and he had just gone through this period where he's just deprived of all enjoyable things in life. And so this is like a heavy food and drink book, just
he's
on the fun end. Yeah.
Lasagna, yeah.
He later on, he's like so proud of this book. He considered it his best work, and then like a decade later, he reads it's like, it was a little bit much, wasn't it? I think we went too far here. But it's a great book, I think, particularly in this age of sort of skepticism, not just skepticism, which is healthy, but cynicism, which I think is unhealthy. The way that anyone who has a religious viewpoint whatsoever is just sort of dismissed and cast off, and you don't really give them a second look at it. I think it's a very brilliant book. I think it'll take you places. It travels throughout Europe, so it's just kind of enjoyable on an aesthetic level, but it also gets deep into the heart of the human person and the people who are very imperfect characters. I never like the Christian like books or movies or songs where like everything's happily ever after, but I like where there's sort of like that element of like the imperfect characters who keep striving. I think the saints were like that. We read about the saints and we read about all their highlights, but we hear Saint Jose Maria. Saint is one who struggles, and there are characters in this book who struggle, and some of them it turns out well for them. Some of them they fail in that struggle, and I think that's the drama of this life. Is it's so easy if you read history to think, well, Hitler was always going to be a bad guy, and like my grandfather storming the beaches in Normandy was always going to be a good guy. No, all these outcomes, all these moments in history or even in our own lives, they are all hinging upon individual decisions that we make in the moment, and that's where the drama is.
And for the reader, they need to know to stick with it. I think Bridesmaid's something you get into and you're like, all right, I don't care about all these people in their lives, but you have to keep going.
And there's a character in it who's just a drunken idiot who makes it easier to keep going because he's a funny drunken idiot.
You need the drunken idiot. You need that guy to keep it going, especially in that book. There is a lot of food references, which is what I like. So, yeah, it's a great book. It's many people's favorite book of all time. I mean, it's probably the most famous book on here, except for The Imitation of Christ, by far. So, I think that's a wrap.
Well, I have one more.
You have one more. Okay.
So speaking of making lots of decisions and how that directs your life, fun summer read doesn't have to be a sit down and all in one read. You can pick it up and put it down and pick it up a couple days later. Fun one that I read is called Spy Secrets That Can Save Your Life by former CIA agent Jason Hansen.
So it's not the Detroit Lions kicker?
No, it's not the Detroit Lions kicker. I don't
Steve
think.
is very familiar with being an NFC North guy.
So this is a cool book that probably not for the most paranoid, or maybe it's the favorite one for the most paranoid, but teaches you things like how do you get out of duct tape, being duct taped to a chair with duct tape around your hands. All kinds of tips like that, tips on how to spot a crime that's about to happen or an assault that's about to happen either on you or someone else, and how to prevent it. So essentially, really cool tips from a former CIA agent. Has all kinds of links in there for little weapons that you can carry and videos you can watch for how to do these things. It's cool. I met this guy at CrimeCon, actually. It's pretty cool.
So this is like random Heather facts. This is number one.
But this is very pro-life.
CrimeCon?
CrimeCon.
I feel like we need a little deeper dive into that.
It's
No,
Not long,
you don't,
but-
because those people are weird and they're all into it.
They're a mix. There's a mix of non as weird people like me, and then really weird
Do
people.
people wear costumes to it?
Okay.
What do you think?
In all
Just wanted to hear her
seriousness,
say it.
in all seriousness, they ban costumes
Okay.
because
That's not
it's
helping,
very
but okay.
inappropriate. Well, think about it. You don't like show up dressed up as like, what's his face, Ted Bundy to a crime con,
I think that would be funny.
No, not if you have victims there.
The victims are there. You can't
Victims
do
are
it.
there.
going to
like-
CrimeCon?
I know.
Because they're sharing their testimonies. There's like
Oh,
they're
it's
presenting.
a serious
it's
thing.
True crime.
I thought this was like, and then if you take the toothpick and jab it in the bottom of the guy's neck.
Okay, there can be stuff like that, and obviously people can have fun with the former CIA agent asking him questions. But they have law enforcement there. They have canine units.
Oh,
they can
I didn't
show
know that.
you.
So there's some legit
It's
training.
legit stuff in this
Okay.
thing. It's true crime. There are crazies that come there. Yes.
There's the huge
but
crime fiction and true crime, like
Podcasts.
people are entertained
Yes.
by reading about serial killers,
Yes.
but this is
Awful.
not that. This is
no, it's also that.
It's that.
It's also that.
It's. I had one of these people who we know go on their rant to me, and I won't mention them because they, whatever. It's weird. It's like a cult, and they're totally into it. You've got to do CrimeCon, and that's all they talk about. And then they give you the details. There was this one serial killer in Miami, and you're like, I don't need to know about this guy.
I'd be better off not knowing.
Yeah, and so.
But now you can look for serial killers in your life.
Can you get me a
And
ticket
how-
next year just for research purposes?
Yes, actually.
Jason Hansen, was it 1995 or 96 in the Dome in Detroit? He upset the Packers on Thanksgiving. That's why you remember him. You were probably 10 or 11. That must have ripped your heart out.
Always back to
The
sports.
Packers were on top, and I was a Cowboy fan, so I'm just like, yes, you yelling at Favre.
Well, here's the thing is when he was all wrapped up in duct tape, I thought there was no way he was going to make the 53-yard field goal.
But remember that? There was a Thanksgiving Day where they kicked like a 53-yard field goal at the end, and they upset the Packers on Thanksgiving.
I don't remember that. I'll have
It's
to
in the mid-90s.
go to the archives.
Look it up, viewer, on your spare time when you're not going to CrimeCon. But that was a big thing. That's why I knew his name. Not because of the weird CIA guy, but the kicker for the Detroit Lions. That's what we've been thinking
That's
about
great.
as
Yeah.
you were trying to offer a good book.
Yeah,
We were just
yeah.
like thinking about
Totally connects.
Detroit.
90s NFL ruled.
It did. It did. It wasn't easy to win championships back then.
We went to just on a family vacation. We stopped by the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and there was some show or whatever that we were seeing at it. And they had to kill time because they were running behind, and they did it with like NFL trivia, and they were all like 1989 to 2003, and I had to like quit answering because I was becoming that guy.
Yeah.
It was not good. Last 10 years, I don't know who's good. I'm not sure who's still playing, but yeah.
The 90s were like the prime of Steve Carlin's sports knowledge.
Yeah, and yours too, I imagine.
Oh, for sure. For sure. But yeah, you just must have been like, and we included some of that in the podcast. You knew who Kevin Brown was. You knew about the Palmeiro Will Clark trade twice. So there were you have some great references. Okay, we're done here.
Covered a lot of ground.
We
on the
covered a
4
lot
Today
of
Soy
ground.
podcast.
So happy D-Day to all of you out there. Be sure, we forgot to mention in the midst of everything that applications to lead a 40 Days for Life campaign are officially open. They will be open most of June. So be sure to lead a campaign, and you are allowed to lead a campaign. If you do not have an abortion provider or an abortion referral center, you can go to CVS or Walgreens, where they will soon be dispensing abortions. So we have
Or if
that.
Rite Aid hasn't gone completely under yet, you could go there too.
If Rite Aid hasn't
Rite
gone
Aid.
bankrupt yet, but they're on the verge of collapse, thankfully. So you can sign up for one of those pharmacy campaigns in the fall, and we take you A to Z in the training. So for all campaigns. So thank you, Heather. Thank you. I'm just going to think about the CIA crime thing all day. Thank you, Steve. Be sure to rate, review, and share this podcast, and we will see you next time.